Welcome back to the Pirate Republic. This is an audiobook presentation of Pirates of the Wild West, the first novel in the Storm of Time series, released one chapter at a time. I'm really excited for this next chapter, Chapter 10, The James Gang. It brings a lot of Western elements to this pirate story. I find it very exciting, and the reason that I wanted to write these books is because I love Westerns. I love the action-adventure of them, the characters, the anti-heroes of those days. And this is the start of one of my favorite relationships in the stories. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but I think you'll like it as well. Grab your cutlass, load your revolver, and get ready for Chapter 10. Chapter 10, The James Gang. Jesse led his brother Frank and the younger brothers, Cole and Jim, into the alleyway behind the Wells Fargo Bank, located on the corner of California Street and Montgomery Street. The building was a two-story red and brown brick structure with a small second-story balcony overhanging the front entrance. There was a heavy wooden door that served as the rear entrance to the bank, and the cowboys stood watchfully outside. The entire backside of the building was windowless, so Jesse had chosen this location for them to ready their heist without being seen. The four men double-checked the loadout of their pistols and the double-barrel shotguns each of the younger brothers carried. Frank and I will go around the front and force the guard inside the bank and lock the entrance. You two wait here in back for one of us to open up this rear door for you once we're inside, Jesse said. Them streets are more crowded than yesterday. We won't have much time before someone knows what's up, Cole said. We'll be quick. No safe unless it's open. Then make for the horses, Frank said. The men nodded at each other, and Jesse and Frank made their way out of the alley with their heads on swivels. Frank scanned the street for any sign of extra law enforcement, while Jesse focused on the guard standing by the door of the bank. Jesse had a dollar coin in his hand that he began to flip up in the air, catching it, then flipping it again. The guard noticed the two James brothers as they approached the bank, and Jesse continued to flip the coin. Jesse deliberately missed the catch as they approached, and the guard, distracted, watched the coin fall to the walkway. He bent down to pick up the coin, and Frank and Jesse manhandled him through the door of the bank. Jesse grabbed the guard's pistol from its holster and clubbed him in the head with the butt. The two brothers quickly pulled their bandanas over their noses to conceal their identities. Frank's pistol was already in his hand as Jesse closed and locked the door behind them, and he pointed it around the room as all heads turned toward the commotion. "Get your hands up or get shot!" Frank yelled out to the startled patrons and employees. Jesse stuffed the guard's pistol into his belt and pulled his own from its holster, threatening each person in the bank. There were 3 patrons making transactions and 3 employees behind the barred counter. Jesse quickly crossed the room, pointing his gun at the nearest teller. "Open the door," Jesse said with menace. I'm not supposed to," stuttered the teller. "Are you supposed to die today?" Jesse was pointing his pistol through the bars at the man. He pulled back the hammer of the gun, cocking it audibly. The man was sweating and looked faint. "Open it!" Jesse yelled. The man practically jumped, and with his hands in the air he moved to the locked door and fumbled a moment with his keys as Jesse followed with his pistol pointing at the man's head. The moment the key turned in the lock, Jesse slammed the door open, knocking the man off his feet. "Everyone inside and have a squat over there," Frank said as he ushered the patrons and employees against the wall inside the teller's room. Jesse made his way to the rear of the bank and unlatched the door for Cole and Jim to enter. The 3 cowboys rushed back into the teller's room where Frank stood guard. Jim roughly tossed a bag to the first patron and brandished his shotgun at him. "Empty your pockets into the bag, then pass it down. I better not see a speck of jewelry on you that doesn't go in the bag lest I fill your gut full of lead." Jesse and Cole went through the teller's drawers, pulling out cash, coin, and a few gold nuggets to put in their saddlebags. Jesse looked back at the safe sitting closed and locked against the far wall. He licked his lips and looked over at the teller with the keys. He strutted over and pulled his pistol from its holster and placed it against the man's head. "Open the safe." Jim looked questioningly from the safe to Jesse. "I thought we were going to leave the safe if it was locked." "We got time," Jesse said. Jim looked out at the front door. Just then, a jarring noise could be heard as a patron stood outside and tried to open the locked door. The man then put his face up to the window to peer inside the bank. "We ain't got time," Jim said. "We got time. Now open the safe," Jesse yelled at the teller and grabbed the man's shirt, pulling him up. Jesse forced the now crying man to the safe and held his pistol to the back of his head. "Open it." "God damn it," Jim muttered under his breath. "Cole, watch the front. We could have law here any minute." The teller fumbled and shook as he tried to turn the dial for the correct combination, while Jesse continued to threaten him. Come on, Frank said. Click. The safe's lock opened, and the teller leaned back. Jesse pushed the man out of the way and swung the safe's door open, revealing neatly stacked bills and a tray full of small gold nuggets. The four cowboys stared at the contents of the safe from where they stood. A broad smile formed on Jesse's face. He looked at Cole and raised his eyebrows at him. "All right, you can gloat later. Let's pack it up," Cole said. "Drop your weapon, bastard!" Ann Bonny yelled as she entered the room from the back. The entire crowd turned in surprise to see the fiery-haired woman holding a pair of flintlock pistols, one pointed at Jesse, the other in the direction of Jim, Cole, and Frank. Jesse immediately knew who she was, and a sly smile crossed his lips. "Someone forgot to lock the back door," he said. "You took my love from me, you bastard." Anne spit out her words. "Now that was a fair draw, miss, nor was it my idea to have it in the first place. You started it with your insults. Jack was honor-bound." "Maybe that's partly true, but he asked for pistols," Jesse said, raising his hands a bit, but still holding his pistol in one. "He could have just punched Jesse in the eye instead," Jim Younger said. "I'm honor-bound to avenge his death, so we'd be having a duel as well," Anne said. "We're kind of in the middle of robbing this bank, girl, so maybe this can wait," Frank said. There was a loud knocking on the front door. A quick glance by all showed a small crowd out front trying to peer inside through the windows. Anne glanced at the contents of the safe, eyeing the gold and stacks of bills. "Open up this door!" A shout came from outside the front door, along with more pounding. "We gotta go!" Frank yelled. "Why don't we finish here? Then you and I can finish our issue after. That way all this money doesn't go to waste," Jesse said to Anne. Anne looked again at the safe, then back at Jesse. A moment passed without any talking or movement, other than the pounding on the front door. Jesse took her silence as acceptance and nodded to Cole. Jesse remained with his hands up, and Cole emptied the contents of the safe into his saddlebag, that he then hefted to his shoulder. Jesse indicated the back door with his head to Anne, and she watchfully backed up toward the rear exit. A smile crossed Jesse's face, and he slowly put his hands down. Anne and the four cowboys exited into the alleyway behind the bank and stood facing each other. Seconds later, two men with rifles and metal stars on their chests burst into the alleyway. "Drop 'em!" one of the lawmen yelled. The four cowboys turned toward the lawmen and opened fire, sending the pair into cover behind the corner. A chaos of bullets erupted from both sides, and the cowboys started down the alley in the opposite direction to the lawmen. Anne was at a crossroads with her two pistols, one still trained on Jesse, but the other she pointed at the lawman firing in her direction indiscriminately. She could shoot Jesse now, but the odds were that she would be the next one shot, either by the lawman or the cowboys. She cringed as a bullet from the corner of the alley whizzed by her cheek, narrowly missing her. Two more lawmen entered the fray. One stood his ground out in the open, firing his rifle in her direction. Anne made her decision by firing both pistols at the man, scoring each time, hitting the man in his chest, sending him falling back onto the hard ground. "Let's go!" Jesse yelled to her, and she turned and followed Frank, Cole, and Jim further down the alleyway, with Jesse covering their exit. More men were pouring into the chase behind them as they took a few turns on their escape route and continued running for a few blocks. The crew stopped for a breather a short way from a main street. Anne pulled an empty pistol from her belt along with a powder case and ball. Jesse watched as she expertly filled the muzzle and loaded the shot. He shook his head and pulled from his own belt the pistol that he took from the guard and spun it so that the grip was out toward her. She glanced at the revolver, then into Jesse's captivating eyes before shoving her own flintlock back into her belt and taking the revolver. Jesse smirked at her, then nodded for the group to continue out into the street. "Stop! Hold it!" Several armed men shouted at the group when they emerged onto the open street. The lawmen were advancing toward them, pointing rifles and pistols. Pedestrians shouted and ran from the scene. Several wagons pulled away and sped in the opposite direction as the threat of violence arose from the two groups. Anne pointed her newly acquired revolver at the oncoming lawmen and opened fire, sending the men in search of cover. The men began to fire back as the bandits made a right-hand turn down the next street. "Behind that church over there!" Jim shouted. The crew made a dash for the white-painted wooden church that stood on the next corner. Just as they were arriving at the building, a lawman on horseback emerged from the street in front of them, pistol in hand. The lawman fired a couple rounds at them and successfully clipped Jim in the arm, sending him spinning to the ground next to a horseless wagon parked near the church. Jesse fired back at the lawman but missed, and the bandits took cover behind the wagon. "You hurt bad?" Cole asked his brother. Jim was holding his hand over his wound and grimacing in pain. Frank pulled Jim's hand from his arm and looked at the damage. "Ah, he'll live, if we can get out of here, that is," he said. Jesse stuck his head out from behind the wagon to take a look and almost got it blown off by the lawman on horseback, pacing on the other side. "Damn, more coming up the road. I'll cover you. Count of 3, Jesse said. Anne nodded at Jesse and looked over at the church. It was about 20 yards away. Jesse stood to one side of the wagon as the others readied their escape on the other. 1, 2, 3. Jesse spun around the wagon and started giving covering fire. Cole, Jim, Frank, and Anne darted toward the church. They got about halfway when Jim tripped while holding his bleeding arm and went down in front of Anne. She stumbled on top of him and rolled off into the dirt. She turned from her position on the ground to see Jesse backing up toward them while in a shootout with the horse-mounted lawman. Jesse's pistol went click after he had used up all the ammo. The horse reared up, then settled down on all fours, giving the lawman a clear shot at Jesse standing there. The lawman took careful aim and pulled back on the trigger. Blam! Jesse stood there, not knowing if the man had missed or if he just didn't feel the shot yet. He watched as the lawman's gun slowly dropped from his hand, then he followed it to the ground, dead from a wound in his chest. Jesse turned to see Anne there next to Jim, holding the pistol he had given her, smoke swirling around the barrel. Anne and Jesse stared at one another for a beat. "Let's get the hell out of here," Jim said, gathering himself up. Frank and Cole arrived from the back of the church on horseback, each holding the reins of an additional horse. Jim painfully climbed onto one of them. Jesse looked back to see several lawmen rushing down the street toward them. He mounted his horse, then circled it around Anne. Jesse held his hand out toward her. She looked at his outstretched hand, then glanced at the lawman. "Come on!" Jesse shouted at her. Anne turned and looked up at Jesse. He had that crooked smile on his face. She quickly made her decision and grabbed Jesse's hand. In one fluid motion, he swung her up behind him. Anne pointed her revolver at the lawmen running toward them and fired her last 2 rounds. "Yah!" Jesse yelled at his horse, and the bandits took off at a fast gallop out of town. Anne held tight to Jesse's waist while her thoughts raged at her. They had been riding fast for over 30 minutes, and the horses were foaming with exhaustion. She had contemplated reaching for her knife and slitting Jesse's throat in revenge several times. It would be easy to kill him, slide him off the horse, and take the reins herself. This man had killed her poor Jack just yesterday. How did she wind up riding on the back of his horse, saving his life, and robbing a bank alongside him and his gang of cowboys? Anne was no stranger to the rough and wild life that men like Jack and Jesse lived. She herself could be judged as a dangerous and deadly woman. Anne was only 13 when she stabbed one of her father's servant girls, after she squealed on her for a tryst that she'd had with a young man who was a sailor on one of her father's merchant ships. Anne's father had quickly sent that man on a year-long voyage to the Orient, never to return. She had married her husband, James Bonney, at 17. James had bragged about being an accomplished sailor and a well-known pirate. He had promised her a life of adventure, but she found out years later he was a coward known for double-crossing other pirates. He turned out to be a poor sailor and a worse pirate. Anne's father had seen through James' lies and exaggerations. He disapproved of Anne secretly marrying him and disowned her, kicking her out of his plantation homestead. Homeless and cut out of any inheritance or family money, Anne and James decided to move to the pirate haven of Nassau, but not before Anne, in a drunken rage, burned her father's plantation house to the ground in retaliation. How life can change in the falling of a knife. In a matter of days, Anne had lost both her husband and her lover. She chuckled to herself with a moment of self-loathing as she held the muscular torso of the man who successfully dueled Calico Jack Rackham, her fallen sweetheart. Her quest for vengeance was already beginning to fade. She recalled a saying from her best friend Mary, "Bury the dead before they get in the way of the living." Anne was brought out of her musing as Jesse slowed his horse by pulling the reins. The four horses stopped just off the trail in front of an old abandoned mine shaft. She slid down from the horse and looked around at the broken tools and piles of rocks and lumber. The cowboys dismounted their horses and Jim went to sit, exhausted, holding his injured arm with his back against a fallen tree. Frank looked over at Anne and asked, "You got any skills at tending to wounded men?" "I ain't no nursemaid," Anne said sourly as she toured the site. Cole and Frank walked over to look at Jim's arm. It was still weeping blood, and Cole helped his brother remove his bloody shirt. Looking closely at Jim's arm, he could see the bullet went straight through, missing the bone in his upper arm. He ripped the other sleeve from the discarded shirt and used it as a bandage to tie around the wound, which would hopefully stop the blood from flowing out. "Going to need to be cleaned and stitched up," Cole said. "Why don't you boys head to San Pedro, find a doc to patch Jim up," Frank said to the brothers. Anne was fiddling with her new revolver and managed to open the spinning chamber. She pulled out one of the discharged rounds and peered at it, turning it over in her hand. Jesse watched while he tied his horse to the branch of a tree. Anne popped all the rounds out and was examining them as Jesse walked up. "They're spent. Can't load them the way you do your flintlock." Jesse pulled a live round from his belt, which had small loop holders for about a dozen bullets. He held the round out and Anne went to grab it, but Jesse pulled it back and closed his fist around the bullet. Anne looked up at him with furrowed brows. "I'll reload you if you promise you aren't going to use them on me or my boys." Anne put on her performance smile and said sweetly, "Now why would you have such evil thoughts about me?" She held out her hand for the rounds. "Don't trust that girl, Jesse," Cole said as he went to his horse to grab his loaded saddlebag of loot from the bank. "Let's divide this up and separate as usual. We'll meet back up in San Francisco after I get Jim patched up in maybe a week." "Yes, lads, what's the take? And what's my share?" Anne asked. "Your share?" Cole asked. "You don't get a share. You ain't part of the gang." Anne aggressively approached Cole and poked at his chest while her other hand held the hilt of her dagger. "You wouldn't have gotten away with the loot if it weren't for me. You'd be dead." Anne turned to Jesse. "You'd be dead for sure. It was me that saved your skin from being shot by that horseman. Seems I'm entitled to an equal share of this here plunder. 20%, and I'll be on my way." Cole burst out laughing, and quick as a flash, Anne had her knife at his throat. Frank quickly drew his pistol and pointed it at Anne, but Anne's eyes never left Cole as he raised his chin high to keep her blade from piercing his neck. Cole slowly raised his hands. "Drop the knife, woman," Frank said. "Not until we agree on the split," Anne said as she slid her loaded flintlock pistol from her belt and pointed it at Cole's belly. "God damn it, Jesse, do something with her," Cole stuttered, still craning his chin higher. Jesse shook his head, and a bit of a smile crossed his lips. He raised his hands in the air and approached Anne and Cole. "All right, little miss. All right, you've made your point. You did aid a bit in our getaway, even if your first goal was to put a bullet in me out of revenge. Now you ain't part of our gang, nor did you take part in the planning or the robbing. The way I see it, we could part with 5% of the take to you." "What the goddamn hell are you talking about, Jesse?" Frank asked. Jesse continued to approach Anne and Cole and waved his brother off, motioning with his hand for him to cool down. 15, Anne responded without looking away from Cole's face. 10, Jesse countered. Anne considered the offer for a couple of seconds. She pulled the knife from Cole's throat, but kept her pistol ready. She resheathed the blade and turned to Jesse with her hand out to shake. "Deal." Jesse shook her hand with a grin and head shake. "Who are you?" Jesse asked. "Anne Bonny, co-commander of the sloop, William." The cowboys just stared at her with questioning looks. "Well, now that I think of it, since you went and killed Jack, I would be the only remaining commander of the William. So there you have it. And who are you lot? I heard your name is Jesse James." Jesse nodded his head. He pointed his chin at Frank. "My brother Frank, that one you rudely had a knife to be Cole, and his now gimpy brother over there is Jim." "I ain't no gimp, I'll be fine," Jim said, standing up. "All right then, let's divide the take. Give Miss Bonny her share and be on our ways," Jesse said.
hope you're enjoying this historical fiction book with pirates and time travel all wound together in it. You can find the ebook and physical books at my website, briancantrell.com. You can also find the second book in this series, Pirates of World War II. And if you're a fan of pirates, you can check out thepiraterepublic.com. It's a weekly newsletter that I put out every Friday. All sorts of great pirate history, events, news, and happenings. You can also toss a few doubloons our way by joining our Patreon at Patreon, The Pirate Republic. We'll see you next week. Till then, fair winds and keep a weathered eye.